a lot has happened in tech since last Wednesday. Here's a quick recap. Twitter and Facebook banned Trump, resulting in conservative users moving over to less restrictive app Parler, which prompted Amazon to end its web hosting service for the site. And now Parler is suing Amazon for the removal. The shifts taking place in big tech are unprecedented and resulting in the movement of the most extreme political discourse off the mainstream platforms. And our next guest argues that it's all for the best. Alex Webb is Bloomberg opinion columnist, and he joins me now from London. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. Why, in your opinion, is forcing this extreme discourse off the most popular apps the right thing to do?
I mean, fundamentally, because keeping the discourse there hasn't worked, and it's only served to exacerbate the problem. You've often heard Facebook make the argument in the past that just labeling misinformation is adequate, and that if it wasn't hosted on Facebook, it would just disappear to another part of the internet. And in my mind, frankly, that's a good thing. The audience that you can reach on Facebook, something like 2.5 billion people across its platforms, similar in size perhaps to YouTube, is otherwise sort of incomparable. And going to somewhere like Parler or Gab or elsewhere, they are a tiny fraction of what Facebook and YouTube have, and it simply won't manage to push people who are perhaps have more moderate views towards more radical viewpoints.
But doesn't this open a can of worms? Should technology executives be the ones who say what's okay and what's not okay for people to do online?
I mean, I think as long as the tech companies are saying that up front, and they're saying that you can't incite people to violence, you can't particularly if it's fueled by lies, then absolutely, you are breaching the terms and conditions for which you signed up to the website. I think that, you've got to forget, these are private companies. I don't have the right, if I were to write a manuscript for a book, I don't have the right to go to HarperCollins or anyone else and demand that they publish my book. They can make a choice whether they want to or not. Now, clearly, we are getting into the territory of whether they're a publisher or not. To my mind, they absolutely are a publisher, and by doing this, they seem to have tacitly admitted it themselves. And now we've perhaps resolved that argument. I think that we can move forward in deciding what is or isn't at home on social media.
Okay, so without getting too wonky into regulatory issues here, the words you just uttered, that these are publishers, that has big implications for the way that Washington, D.C. and regulators treat these platforms, right?
It does, but these conversations are already progressing at pace. I don't think, frankly, anything we've seen in the last few weeks substantively changes the discussions that are going to be had going forward on Capitol Hill. What it does change is the ammunition that the different sides of the political equation can use when reaching those decisions. And it clearly does provide fuel for Republicans to complain about conservative censorship. I think unfortunately, Donald Trump and some of his followers have not made this any easier because they have, because he has sort of incited them to violence, it seems, in a lot of cases, and they are reacting appropriately to the shocking events of last week.
Does this turn into a game of whack-a-mole for tech companies if they leave these platforms and go to another platform, like Gab, for example? Does that create issues for how these companies are able to police what's going on their platforms?
Yes, it does, and that's the way it should be. Facebook employs 35,000 people to moderate content. That's a tiny, tiny number given, as I said, they have something like 2 billion users. This is something that they should have built into their systems from day one. Actually, if you look at the reasons why Parler has been taken down, particularly from the app stores of Google and Apple, it's because they're not actually adhering to their own rules, i.e., Parler is not following its own rules on content moderation. Parler says you can't incite violence on its platform. Well, that is something that has happened, and it hasn't taken that content down, or at least not quickly. And that is what Google and Apple are saying they have to do more effectively. So essentially what you're seeing is that they're forcing Parler to do what Facebook also had to do, employ more content moderators, because that is the only way to ensure that these platforms are a safe space to have, sensible discussion.
We know that the president is very unhappy about this social media ban. And we learned yesterday that he was considering making some sort of statement on big tech. What might the president have planned for his final days in office when it comes to reining in big tech, as he puts it?
I mean, there's very little that he can do in terms of reining in big tech, as far as I understand it. One interesting idea, which I think possibly should gain steam, is the idea that you look at some of these huge platforms as utilities, that because they have a sort of de facto monopolistic position in terms of Facebook, or particularly maybe Google, then maybe you should think about regulating them as utilities, where they will still turn off huge amounts of cash for their investors, but they don't necessarily have control over pricing when it comes to ads, and also the sort of content they host, and that is regulated more centrally.
Bloomberg Opinion's Alex Webb joining us live from London. Alex, thank you as always for your time.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quicktake now for insight in an instant.